What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors gets pushed too far by a television host who thinks he can challenge anyone? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down for what should have been a straightforward conversation, only to find himself facing a barrage of accusations and provocative questions that cross every line of professional decency. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly respect can turn to raw confrontation when someone refuses to back down. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two powerhouses clash in the most explosive way possible. Last night's episode started like any other, with George Stephanopoulos adjusting his tie and shuffling through his notes with that familiar smugness that regular viewers have come to expect. The studio lights were perfectly positioned, the cameras rolling, and there sat Denzel Washington, calm, composed, wearing that characteristic slight smile that has graced countless red carpets and press junkets over his legendary career. But what neither the audience nor Washington himself could have anticipated was how quickly this conversation would spiral into something far more sinister than anyone bargained for. Stephanopoulos opened with what seemed like standard pleasantries, asking about Washington's latest project, his family, the usual celebrity interview fodder that fills the first few minutes of any talk show appearance. Washington answered with his typical grace and thoughtfulness, speaking about his craft with the passion of someone who has dedicated his life to storytelling. His responses were measured, articulate, and delivered with that unmistakable gravitas that has made him one of the most commanding presences in entertainment. But something was different about Stephanopoulos tonight. There was an edge to his voice, a particular gleam in his eye that suggested he had something more provocative in mind than discussing Washington's upcoming film roles. The veteran journalist kept glancing down at his notes with increasing frequency, as if building up the courage to pivot toward whatever controversial territory he had planned to explore. Washington, ever the professional, maintained his composure, but those who know how to read body language could see the subtle shift in his posture, a slight straightening of the shoulders, a more focused gaze that suggested he was beginning to sense something was amiss. The first real warning sign came when Stephanopoulos suddenly shifted gears, abandoning the entertainment-focused questions entirely. His tone became more clinical, more confrontational, as he began probing into Washington's political views and social commentary. The questions weren't necessarily inappropriate on their face, but there was something in the delivery that felt less like journalism and more like an interrogation. Washington handled these inquiries with his characteristic diplomacy, offering thoughtful responses that demonstrated both his intelligence and his reluctance to be drawn into cheap political theater. But Stephanopoulos wasn't satisfied with diplomatic answers. He pressed harder, interrupting Washington mid-sentence with follow-up questions that seemed designed more to trap than to illuminate. The host's voice grew sharper, his interruptions more frequent, and his questions increasingly loaded with assumptions and implications that were clearly intended to provoke rather than inform. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his responses became more measured, more careful, the behavior of a man who was beginning to recognize that he was not in a conversation but rather in some sort of verbal ambush. The atmosphere in the studio began to change palpably. The crew members, who had witnessed countless interviews over the years, started exchanging glances that suggested they, too, could sense something unusual was happening. This wasn't the typical back and forth of a celebrity interview, nor was it even the kind of challenging journalism that Stephanopoulos was known for. This was something else entirely, something that felt personal, targeted, and deliberately inflammatory. Washington leaned back in his chair slightly, a gesture that might have appeared relaxed to casual viewers, but actually signaled a man who was creating space, both physically and mentally, to assess what was happening and how he wanted to respond. His hands remained folded in his lap, his voice remained controlled. But there was a new quality to his attention, the focused alertness of someone who had realized they were in hostile territory and needed to proceed with extreme caution. Stephanopoulos continued his aggressive line of questioning, now bringing up controversies and incidents from years past, rehashing old stories that had been thoroughly examined and resolved long ago. He presented these topics as if they were breaking news, as if Washington had never addressed them before, and with a tone that suggested guilt by association and demanded immediate accountability for things that had been settled years earlier. The host's strategy was becoming clear. He wasn't interested in Washington's current projects or perspectives. He was attempting to litigate the past and force the actor into a defensive position. But Washington wasn't taking the bait, at least not yet. Instead, he responded to each provocative question with the kind of thoughtful restraint that comes from decades of dealing with difficult interviews and hostile press. He corrected misconceptions calmly, provided context where it had been deliberately omitted, and maintained his dignity even as Stephanopoulos continued to escalate his attacks. However, those watching closely could see that Washington's patience was not infinite, and that each inappropriate question was pushing him closer to a line that, once crossed, would change the entire dynamic of this encounter. The tension was building to a crescendo that would soon explode into something nobody in that studio was prepared for. The moment everything changed came when Stephanopoulos leaned forward with that predatory smile that has become his trademark, when he thinks he's about to land a devastating blow. He pulled out what appeared to be a printed article, waving it slightly in the air like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Washington's eyes narrowed as he watched this theatrical display, recognizing immediately that whatever was coming next was going to cross every boundary of professional courtesy and basic human decency. "Denzel," Stephanopoulos began, his voice dripping with false concern, "I have to ask you about some troubling allegations that have recently surfaced regarding your involvement with certain political organizations back in the 1990s. There are reports suggesting that you attended events and made donations to groups that some critics have labeled as controversial, even extremist. How do you respond to accusations that you supported organizations that promoted divisive rhetoric?" The silence that followed was deafening. Washington's face went completely still, his eyes fixed on Stephanopoulos with an intensity that could have cut through steel. Anyone who knew Washington's actual history would immediately recognize these allegations as either completely fabricated or so wildly distorted as to be unrecognizable. But more than that, everyone in the room could sense that something fundamental had just shifted. This was no longer an interview. It was a character assassination attempt being broadcast live to millions of viewers. Washington's response came slowly, deliberately, each word measured and controlled in a way that somehow made them more powerful than if he had shouted, "George, I'm going to stop you right there. What you just said is not only completely false, it's irresponsible journalism at its worst. You're sitting there with what looks like a piece of paper, making accusations without any foundation, and expecting me to defend myself against lies. That's not how this works." But Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. If anything, Washington's pushback seemed to energize him, as if he had been waiting for exactly this kind of reaction. He pressed forward with even more aggression, citing unnamed sources and unverified reports, building an entire narrative of misconduct out of thin air. His voice grew louder, more insistent, as he demanded that Washington explain his pattern of controversial associations and his history of supporting radical causes. "You want to talk about patterns, George?" Washington's voice remained controlled, but there was now an unmistakable edge to it that sent a chill through the studio. "Let's talk about your pattern of ambush journalism. Let's talk about how you invited me here under false pretenses, pretending this was going to be a professional conversation about my work, and instead you're sitting there with fabricated accusations trying to destroy my reputation on live television." The confrontation was escalating rapidly now, with both men leaning forward in their chairs, the physical distance between them somehow making the tension even more palpable. Stephanopoulos continued his attack, bringing up more unsubstantiated claims, each one more outrageous than the last. He questioned Washington's patriotism, his integrity, his commitment to his community, all based on what he claimed were credible sources, that he refused to name or identify. Washington's restraint was remarkable, but it was clearly being pushed to its absolute limit. His hands were no longer folded calmly in his lap. They were gripping the arms of his chair with enough force that his knuckles were beginning to show white. His voice remained steady, but each response was becoming sharper, more direct, cutting through Stephanopoulos' accusations with surgical precision. "You know what, George? I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've dealt with tough interviews, challenging questions, even hostile journalists. But what you're doing right now isn't journalism. It's a hit job. You're using your platform to spread lies and hoping that if you say them with enough authority, people will believe them. That's not just unprofessional, it's cowardly." The word cowardly hit Stephanopoulos like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for the first time since the interview began, he seemed to lose some of his composure. But instead of backing down or acknowledging that he had crossed a line, he doubled down, becoming even more aggressive and personal in his attacks. He began questioning Washington's motives for taking certain film roles, suggesting that his career choices reflected some kind of hidden agenda or political manipulation. "Are you serious right now?" Washington's voice was rising for the first time, though it still maintained that commanding quality that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. "You're questioning my artistic choices? You're suggesting that my entire career has been some kind of political conspiracy? Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound?" The studio crew was now openly staring at the confrontation unfolding before them. This had gone far beyond anything they had ever witnessed during their time working on the show. Camera operators were looking at each other uncertainly, unsure whether they should continue filming or if someone should intervene. The producer in the control room was frantically gesturing, but it was unclear whether he wanted them to cut to commercial or keep rolling to capture what was clearly becoming a historic television moment. Stephanopoulos, perhaps sensing that he was losing control of the situation, made what would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. He decided to get personal, bringing up Washington's family, his children, suggesting that his radical associations might be having a negative influence on the next generation. The moment those words left his mouth, something changed in Washington's demeanor that was visible even to viewers watching at home. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Washington's entire body language shifted from defensive to offensive. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened, and his eyes locked onto Stephanopoulos with a focus that was both intimidating and absolutely riveting. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, but filled with such authority and barely contained fury that every person in that studio understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Now you've crossed a line that you can't uncross, George. You want to attack me? Fine. You want to question my work, my politics, my choices? I can handle that. But the moment you bring my family into your gutter journalism, the moment you suggest that I'm somehow corrupting my children with imaginary radical ideas, you've shown everyone exactly what kind of person you really are." The confrontation had reached its point of no return, and everyone could sense that what happened next would determine not just how this interview ended, but potentially the future of both men's careers. What followed was a moment of silence so profound that it seemed to suck all the air out of the studio. Washington sat perfectly still, his gaze never wavering from Stephanopoulos, who was now fidgeting nervously with his papers, perhaps finally beginning to realize that he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures far beyond any reasonable limit. The crew members had stopped pretending to work and were watching in stunned fascination as this legendary actor prepared to deliver what everyone sensed would be a response that would be talked about for years to come. When Washington finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, and filled with such quiet authority that every word seemed to carry the weight of his entire career behind it. "George, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because I'm only going to say it once. For 40 years, I have built my reputation on integrity, hard work, and respect for others. I have never had to defend my character, because my actions have always spoken for themselves. But you, sitting there, with your manufactured outrage and your fabricated accusations, trying to tear down a man's life's work for what? For ratings? For clicks? For some twisted sense of journalistic satisfaction? Stephanopoulos attempted to interrupt, but Washington held up his hand with such commanding presence that the host immediately fell silent. It was a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and absolutely devastating, showing everyone watching exactly who had the real power in this room. No, George. You've had your time to talk. You've had your opportunity to spread your lies and make your accusations. Now it's my turn. Washington's voice grew stronger, more resonant, channeling every ounce of the gravitas that had made him a commanding presence on screen and off. You want to question my patriotism? I've spent my entire career telling stories that celebrate the best of America, that show the complexity and beauty of the human experience. You want to question my integrity? I've used my platform to support education, to fight for civil rights, to help young people who look like me believe that they can achieve anything. The studio was completely silent now, with even the technical crew frozen in place, afraid to make any sound that might interrupt what was clearly becoming a historic moment in television. Washington continued, his voice rising not in anger but in passion, in the kind of righteous indignation that comes from a man who has lived his life with purpose and refuses to let anyone diminish that legacy. You brought up my family, George. You suggested that somehow I'm corrupting my children with radical ideas. Let me tell you about my children. They are educated, thoughtful, compassionate human beings who contribute to society and treat others with respect. They learned those values not from any political organization, but from watching their parents work hard, give back to their community, and stand up for what's right. Something you clearly wouldn't understand. Stephanopoulos was visibly squirming now, his face flushed red, sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the studio's air conditioning. He tried once more to regain control of the interview, stuttering something about just asking the tough questions that viewers deserve to have answered, but Washington cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. Tough questions? Washington's voice was now filled with a kind of controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than any shout could have been. George, tough questions come from a place of genuine curiosity and journalistic integrity. What you've done here tonight is character assassination masquerading as journalism. You invited me here under false pretenses. You've made accusations without evidence, and you've tried to destroy my reputation based on lies and fabrications. That's not tough journalism, George. That's cowardice. The word cowardice hung in the air like a physical presence, and everyone in the studio could see its impact on Stephanopoulos, who seemed to shrink visibly in his chair. Washington stood up slowly, deliberately, his full presence now, towering over the seated host, in a way that was both literal and metaphorical. I've sat here for 20 minutes, listening to you attack my character, question my integrity, and insult my family. I've given you more respect than you deserve and more patience than you've earned. But I'm done now. I'm done pretending that what you're doing deserves any kind of dignified response. Washington began removing his microphone with steady, deliberate movements, each action carried out with the kind of precision that showed this was not an emotional outburst, but a calculated decision by a man who had reached his absolute limit. As he worked to untangle the wire, he continued speaking, his voice never losing its controlled intensity. You know what the real tragedy is here, George. You had the opportunity to have a real conversation with someone who has spent decades in this industry, someone who has stories to tell and insights to share. Instead, you chose to turn this into a circus, a cheap attempt at gotcha journalism that says far more about your character than it could ever say about mine. Stephanopoulos made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation, calling out Washington's name and asking him to sit back down, to continue the conversation, to give him a chance to clarify his questions. But Washington was having none of it. He turned to face the host one final time, his expression calm but unmistakably resolute. George, I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between a journalist and a performance artist. Tonight, you've shown everyone exactly which one you are. I hope it was worth it. He paused, looking directly into the camera with the kind of direct, honest gaze that had made him beloved by millions of fans around the world. To the viewers at home who tuned in expecting to hear about my work and instead got to witness the spectacle, I apologize. You deserved better than this." With those words, Washington turned and walked toward the studio exit with the same dignity and poise he had shown throughout his entire career. His steps were measured, confident, showing no signs of the emotional turmoil that any normal person would be feeling after such a public confrontation. As he reached the edge of the set, he stopped for just a moment, not turning around but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "And George, next time you want to ambush someone, make sure you pick on somebody who doesn't have 40 years of experience dealing with people like you." The studio doors closed behind Denzel Washington with a soft click that somehow sounded like the final word in an argument that had already been decisively won. Stephanopoulos sat alone at his desk, surrounded by his scattered papers and fabricated accusations, looking smaller and more diminished than anyone had ever seen him. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of his obvious discomfort and the empty chair that now served as a monument to his spectacular failure as both a journalist and a human being. In that moment, everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the destruction of a television host's credibility, but a masterclass in dignity, integrity, and the kind of quiet strength that cannot be manufactured or faked. Denzel Washington had walked into that studio as a respected actor and walked out as something even more powerful, a man who had shown the world exactly what it looks like when someone refuses to be diminished by lies, no matter how loudly or publicly they are told.